everybody, and welcome back to the Legal Weekly Wine, where we discuss the week's hottest legal topics. Today, we are going to be talking about the dismantling of the USAID, as well as Trump's threats to take over Gaza and displace Palestinians. We are going to be talking about these on a legal basis. What is the foundation? What are our laws? What can and can't we do, at least legally on paper? And what are the implications from here? I'm Virginia Tehrani. I'm the CEO of The Law Unscripted, which hosts this podcast of the Legal Weekly Wine. I'm also the attorney for Tehrani Law, LLC, because you never need a lawyer till you do. Today, I am joined by my co-host, whose name, hopefully, I pronounce better than the words that I am saying. My co-host is my father. He is Dr. John Weil, the Dean of the Honors College of Middle Tennessee State University, a preeminent scholar in the Constitution, the constitutional law, and the amending process. Dad, good to have you.
Good to be here.
I don't know. We might be one of the only father-daughter podcasts. I don't know. I'll have to look out there, but I'm extremely excited that we have such a podcast.
So much.
Yeah, it's exciting. So, and maybe I'm drinking because of that. I don't know. The weekly wine, we also do some wine. Today, I am going back to one of my colleagues, Ashley Skinker, and her wine that she suggested and brought over. Dr. Weil is drinking out of one of our tumblers. Tell us what the tumbler says.
And it's allegedly coffee.
Yes, allegedly this is coffee in our accented purple. We've also got it in black on thelawunscripted.com. We do not have the wine on our website, but I will drop a link as to where you can find it. It's a beautiful red Barbera d'Alba. Forgiveness for mispronunciation. But cheers, and let's get to this very heavy topic. All right, Dr. Weil, we have an agency called USAID. I keep calling it USAID. I don't know if that's correct or not.
AID.
And honestly, I will say I probably knew a lot less about this organization than I should have before the last week where it's begun to be dismantled. But if you'll tell us a little bit about what this agency is and what its mission and purpose are.
Yeah, it's basically, when we think of national defense, we tend to think of missiles and bombers and guns and soldiers. This is a form of soft power. It's basically a humanitarian arm of the government, but in a broad sense. I mean, the most humanitarian are probably the distribution of food and medical supplies and that kind of thing. But if I recall correctly, years ago, 1987, if I recall, I went to a conference in Mexico City where we were talking both about the Mexican Revolution of 1917 and the U.S. Constitution. And we had a great scholarly conference, and I believe that was financed by USAID. And it was a good way, it was a good way of fostering relationships among Mexican scholars, American. We ended up getting at least one book from it, sort of comparing the Mexican and U.S. constitutions. Again, not terribly splashy, but I think the key on USAID is a lot of their funds are going right now to continuing to supply people, especially in Africa, with medicine for AIDS. And there was almost a whole generation wiped out in Africa. Right. Of this very pervasive disease, and finally they discovered that, and many of them children who simply caught it from their parents, and it's been one of the great success stories, and you would think, right, that people who have food coming in or medical supplies coming in with USA on it, that would make them think favorably, and by the way, this is at a time where China has this Belts and Roads initiative where all over the world they're supplying infrastructure, trying to, stimulate goodwill. But there's always been a residual concern about, why are we sending aid to foreign countries when we have people in our own country who are suffering.
Well,
I
let me
get that.
ask you. Yeah, I understand that too. Is certainly we want to provide for the kids down the street just as much, if not more, than those abroad, in education and health, et cetera. So I certainly get that. I'm much more humanitarian in nature, just personally as well. And with you, were raised with the church. And how many different mission groups did we go with? Did we attend different mission travels that we went to? How much do we still engage with foreign families who are immigrants? So certainly our hearts are a little bit more overall versus just nation. But for this agency, to bring it into some legal territory here, which is what our focus is it a government agency? And if so, where is its legal basis and legal funding?
Well, again, if you consider it part of American soft power, then the easiest justification would be it promotes American defense abroad, attitudes toward America. I, there's a Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. When President Nixon was in office, he would do much like Trump is doing right now. He'd simply declare an end to a program. But the problem was, in our system, Congress appropriates money. Congress has the power of the purse. And basically, what this law said was there are occasions, and this is where we're in a little bit of ambiguity right now. There are occasions where a person can defer or delay a program without actually ending it. For purposes particularly of efficiency, and we talked, I think, in an earlier program,
Right.
If Congress appropriates $100 million for something and it only costs 90, you don't expect them to give the other 10 million away. But I mean, so you have a problem there. The other problem is, let's just think of each of our listeners, and most of them probably do not have governmental jobs, but what would you think if you came into office one day and you were told your job was eliminated?
Right.
Like that. You hadn't done anything wrong. And this goes particularly to the Justice Department, which is a little bit different issue. But new person comes in and says, you were told by the last Attorney General to look into the attack on Washington. We're going to fire all of you for doing that.
Right.
Something, a fundamental principle of law is vested rights. Professors love it. We have tenure. Most of us do. You can't just fire us for something that we say. So I can be a little freer maybe than if I were a member of USAID on talking here. But, there's a matter of fundamental fairness, and there's really a problem. It's easy to take a sledgehammer to something. It's a lot harder to rebuild it. And we had something similar in the 1950s when, Senator McCarthy and others were claiming that there were communists that infiltrated the American State Department.
Right.
They fired hundreds of people, if I remember. It took them decades to build it back because many of these people are specialists.
The knowledge they have.
Studying the country that they're dealing with for 30 or 40 years. And yeah, you can bring somebody in, maybe somebody right out of college who really knows computers. But I have a headline here today, and it was forwarded to me. And so unfortunately, I can't tell you the original source.
Sure.
It sounds like something The Onion would publish.
It really does. When you told me that, I was like, yeah, that does sound like.
It says massive computer error by Doge donates Musk entire fortune to save the children. And one does wonder, if somebody coming in from outside, maybe they can spot something really obvious.
Sure.
But maybe they just don't know what's going on. Maybe they don't understand how a particular program might enhance American interests. And it's always, but remember, this is happening at the same time that President Trump has fired all the inspector generals.
Yes.
Whose purpose is to look into government waste. And you would think, if anything, if you're going to bring these youngsters in, that you would stick them in one of their offices and say, okay, show me where it is, and then
Right.
let's explain or decide whether you've really found waste and fraud and abuse, or if you're just, you're picking a few little low-hanging fruits here and there that have nothing to do with I think it's $34 billion
Right.
that USAID typically spends a year.
Right.
And
And
again,
this does go back, and you were citing our earlier episode. One of the last ones that we did is called Trump's federal funding freeze violates the law. That was where we talked specifically about the funding freeze of the government funds.
right.
So this goes back to that. So if you want to really deep dive into the actual appropriation and redirection or mishandling of funds, go back to that one. But this is another take on it, where it's yet another agency that was funded by Congress through Congress's use of the power of the purse, where they decide where money should go and how it should be spent. And this is one of those organizations.
And just this last week, I mean, I think in the other broadcast that you mentioned, that we mentioned that it did not apparently affect individual aid. But just this last week, there are some Head Start programs who are claiming that they have not been able to receive funding.
Right.
And again, wrecking balls, it's fun to watch a big building, implode. But then somebody has to come and clean it up. And you don't necessarily know that what you're building back is going to be any better than what you had.
Right. So
And yeah.
This actually, in this last week, a judge stepped in and has put a pause on it, has done a preliminary injunction. This is a great legal word. I love the legal terms. And I will tell you, it's hard. These are hard to get. The law, it's really, I can do a lawsuit about what has happened. I have so many cases, whether criminal or civil, about what has happened, trying to make up for that, reimburse, redistribute, do something about what's already happened. But it is very hard and very rare to get a stop to what is currently happening. And that is called an injunction, where you apply to the court to have someone stop doing something immediately or keep doing something immediately, because the potential harm so outweighs anything that could later be redistributed or redone or replaced, that it must be stopped and analyzed now so that future harm can be prevented if it needs to be. And
right. And
it's been
am I
successful.
right? Preliminary injunctions, usually before a judge will issue them, they usually have to judge not only that there's a case, but there's a case where the plaintiffs are likely to win.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So you have to do somewhat of a pre-presentation of your case. You don't always have to have witnesses. You do have to have it under a complaint that's technically under oath of these are the facts as we would set them forth. There are oral arguments on both sides, and that has been done. Both the plaintiff and defense have come in to argue their sides. And in this case, what they've decided, what a judge has decided, and I'm trying to pull up, I've taken so many pictures of so many different articles over the last couple of weeks, but the judge has basically said, you know what, this is, I believe that this is illegal. It takes away Congress's funding power. It actually stops, halts, and reverses everything that they put into an act that the president signed, and it fundamentally will disrupt and harm the agency, the people that the agency gives aid to inside and outside of the United States, so that there's such a risk of prejudicial, fundamental, permanent harm that we have to put a stop to it. And I do wish I'd pulled up the exact one of the couple of articles that I was reading so I could give you the actual name of the judge who did it. But I will say, in all of the concerns that we've had, that everyone's having, this is a very hard time for everyone, wherever you fall on the spectrum, that as an attorney, trying to figure out what role we have, right? As lawyers, as citizens, as professors, as constitutional scholars, what role do we have in this? And for me, it's all about the law, right? What is our law? What's happening? Are we violating the law? And this seems to me to be a violation of the law, of the fundamental first law that we ever had for our Constitution and framing our country. And it's actually been a relief to me to see some lawyers and some judges step up and step into the fray and say, we're going to do something about it. Now, whichever way it goes, I do care in the sense of my own political views, but legally, I'm not as worried as to the whichever way it goes, because I believe that now that the system has stepped in and that it is being reviewed, at least there's possibility of this discourse of back and forth as to what the reasons are. We want to eliminate waste. Well, how can we do that? How can we do that without violating the law? Is there something we can do without violating the law that will better use these funds, better reallocate them to something?
You know, since the time I was an undergraduate, a long time ago, every politician, we're all against waste, fraud, and abuse. And you can always pick out some program that goes to some, particularly an emotional issue, like, a form of birth control that, might result in an abortion, or something related to LGBTQ, something that tends to get attention. You can always find some program somewhere where you can allege abuse.
Right.
But to take something more obvious, if we want to look at abuse, why is it that so many events are held at Mar-a-Lago?
Right.
Where when the Secret Service is there, guess how much they're going to have to pay per
How
room?
much we as citizens are paying for that.
So what is more fraud? And the problem, of course, with Elon Musk is you have an unelected, there's a real irony here. So conservatives have long complained about independent regulatory agencies.
Right.
And they are peculiar, because they're, created by Congress, typically appointed by the president, but with limitations on who he can hire and fire and why he has to do so. So they don't fit neatly within the separation of powers as we understand it. Mm-hmm. But what we're having now is you have an unelected appointee being given apparently tremendous power, maybe even power to look into what our Social Security payments are, or, private, what our private medical records are, without any apparent accountability other than that provided by the president himself. And, this was symbolized last week when Time Magazine put a picture of Elon Musk behind the Resolute desk in the Oval Office.
Right, as their cover.
Who is president? Who did we elect? Yes, we elected Trump, but we didn't elect Elon Musk. Right. And despite Trump saying, I had this mandate, we need to remember that when he was asked about Project 2025, he said, I've never read it. Right. I don't even know who these people are. And now half of them are appointed to his cabinet.
Right.
It maybe not half, but a good number of these people.
At least some of them are. One of the writers has been recently.
Right. They are now saying that, yes, we had a mandate to do this. How can you have a mandate to do something that the president denied even knowing about?
Right. And that not even half of the population through the popular vote voted for.
That's right. That's right.
So with this, with the judges, and that goes to one of the judges I did find in my pronunciations, U.S. District Judge John C. Kogenauer. This was with the birthright citizenship case. I still can't find the other one, but the citizenship case, one of the things that's really striking to me as an attorney is he's labeling Trump's order in that case blatantly unconstitutional. And there's a quote in here that is really speaking to me as an attorney, where he says, there are other times in world history where we look back and people of goodwill can say, where were the judges? Where were the lawyers? And this is really striking to me, is what do we do? What is our role? How do we deal with this? And with that being said, with these sledgehammers, let me use an analogy here, is when we're down to rubble. Well, Gaza's in rubble right now. And to the best of my knowledge, we have no law currently, no congressional power, no other executive order, nothing on the books regarding Gaza with relation to the United States. Maybe there's some USAID work that goes there or humanitarian efforts that go there, but I don't believe there's yet any law regarding Gaza or another foreign country.
Well, let's put a little caveat here. Mm-hmm. The area where the court is least likely to challenge a president is in the area of foreign affairs.
Foreign policy.
Now, there have been some notable exceptions, and probably the best one would be Youngstown Steel Corporation, usually known as the steel seizure case. So during the Korean War, President Truman, there was a strike threatened to close down American steel industries. And they were in a good bargaining position because you need steel for bullets and tanks and planes and whatever. And without going through the congressionally designated Taft-Hartley Act, Truman said, we're simply going to take over the steel industry, put American flags up. We are going to administer it until such time as this is worked out. And the Supreme Court said, usually we defer to presidential power, but in this case, you have a clear congressional law which tells you how to proceed. You've done something different. And to his credit, when the Supreme Court decision came down, Truman was infuriated, but he obeyed the law.
Right.
He said, this is what the Constitution provides. And, this thing in Gaza is very, very bizarre. And it's complicated. It's hard, it's hard to take a side when both sides, in a sense, are have blood on their hands.
Right.
The Gazans, they've been controlled by a group that is clearly a terrorist organization,
Hamas,
and seems to care little for the people that they're supposed to be protecting. And that has been used as a justification by Israel, basically just to wipe everything out. Right. Since we think Hamas might be there, and they may be. We're going to take down this hospital. We're going to take down this school. But the thought of having a president who sees Gaza with 2 million people as a real estate issue, a Riviera on the Mediterranean, is almost otherworldly in terms of, reality.
I thought it was a joke at first.
Right. Why would we own Gaza? Now, should we do what we did after World War II and the Marshall Plan? Would it be appropriate for us to try to rebuild it, and maybe rebuild it in a way that you're on lookout for tunnels and you have some provisions to prevent terrorists from taking it over? But the thought that it becomes ours because Israel has bombed it back into the Stone Age just seems, frankly, absurd.
Well, not even just that it becomes ours, but it becomes ours for our people and not the Palestinians. That we're not trying to remake it for the Palestinians so that they can begin living again, can come back to their land.
The Marshall Plan, there had, I don't know the history that well, but there have to be people who said, why should we rebuild Japan? Why should we rebuild Germany? They're our mortal enemies. But people at the time were farsighted enough to say, but they need not be.
Right.
Particularly if they are democratic, they can be our allies, and they are to this day.
And it's still
Uh,
their
so
land and their country that they want to live in. I mean, will it be hard to rebuild? Absolutely. But displacing, I mean, I'm going back to a very sad time in our country's history with Andrew Jackson and the
yeah,
displacement of the
Trail of
Native
Tears. Yeah.
Americans. Right, the Trail of Tears. I mean, how much of a black eye has that been on the U.S. of completely relocating all of the Native Americans from where they were so that we could have more land and more property and whatever else. So we sent them essentially to their own reservations where they remain today. We forced them there. And in my mind, now we're going across the entire world,
Right. And
seizing countries away to do the same thing, which is a violation of international law.
well, and to fight on behalf of establishing democratic rule, giving the people a choice, as opposed to presenting nakedly our economic interest. And you see this in Ukraine. Now, President Trump seems to have taken a harsher approach to Russia than we initially anticipated he might. But, just a week or two ago, we're floating the idea, well, if we give you aid, then we want you to give us access to rare earth minerals.
Right.
We want this in return. That's the classic argument for imperialism. We want Africa, we want South America because they have gold there,
Right.
or they have, this product there. We're at our best when we're advocating, maybe for free trade. That gives us some economic benefit. But when we're there just because we want somebody's minerals, that really doesn't stand up very well in terms of American ideals.
Right. And in this case, with the displacement of Trump saying, well, Palestinians aren't even going to return, we're going to force them into other countries.
But they have returned, yeah.
Right. First of all, Trump, there's no way Trump would say, oh, okay, well, we'll take somebody else's, 1 million citizens from another country and just take
Egypt
them.
and Jordan to do that, right?
And from my understanding, there are specifically at least a couple of countries where they're saying this is technically an act of war against us by you even saying you're going to displace the Palestinians, by saying that you're going to send them into our territories. And that,
how welcoming is the Trump administration to immigration?
Right.
Why don't we just bring them all to the United States?
Right.
2 million of them. What do you think his reaction would be if that's what Israel told us?
Exactly.
Or Jordan and Egypt did? It really is.
Yeah, so that leads us into the ICC, which is the International Criminal Court. And to what extent do they have jurisdiction over us? Because Trump in this last week with the prime minister from Israel have decided to sanction the ICC and say that they have no authority or power over us or over Israel to actually enforce any kind of arrest warrant against Netanyahu for war crimes, that they have no ability to say that any displacement of the Palestinians would be a criminal act in the international court. And I guess the question is, and this is not my specialty, I will say, but I did have a couple of professors, of course, who were very into international law. And we certainly saw some of the birth of international law at the end of World War II. With the,
Nuremberg trials.
Exactly. Thank you. With the Nuremberg trials, where we even sent one of our Supreme Court justices over to the trials to be a part of it, where we were prosecuting Nazi war criminals. And as a result, some were executed, some were imprisoned, and that we were part of in the creation of this international court. So, we won't touch too much of it, but we certainly want to raise the question of what is their authority? What can and should they do, and how would we be affected? And can we dismiss it just because we don't want to?
I'm not an expert in international law, but if you remember our friend Thomas Hobbes,
Yes, yes.
who thought that the state of nature would be the life of man would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and that we would have a war of all against all. In
Yeah.
some ways, that applies more to international relations than it does domestic relations.
Sure.
If a country refuses to accept the judgment of another, of an international tribunal, there's not a whole lot that can be done about it, absent an international police force, which we really do not have.
Right.
So, especially a nation like ours is strong enough that we can pretty much ignore orders that we don't like. It would be hard to bring enough economic pressure against us to force us to do it. But then if we want to come back and
Yes.
have the international court
Do
say
something
that
for
Iran
us.
is in the wrong, or North Korea is in the wrong, or some other countries are in the wrong, that's sort of dicey business, right?
Right.
Heads I win, tails you lose.
Mhm.
So, can they enforce it against us? Probably not. Would we be wise at least to engage in a conversation when the international community thinks that we're on the wrong side of things? Yes, I think we probably should.
Yeah. Goodness. Okay, so a lot of complications here, and going back very quickly to we discussed this in another episode as well, and I want to make sure I've got this. I believe we were talking about what does the law say about taking Greenland and the Panama Canal? We had that. I'll try to drop that in the description and comments down below so that we have a link to that. Is can we legally take that? And I think this comes into the same sort of area, is can we legally take Gaza? Well, technically, there's nothing in our laws that prevents it, but there are so many other implications that we've started to discuss here and that we also discussed on the prior podcasts. So go back and take a listen to that, take a watch of that, hit like and subscribe so that you can follow us and keep updated on the legal implications of what's happening throughout the country. We also have out there, we've got a podcast about a Tennessee law regarding voting and criminalization of what the votes are used for, as well as federal funding freezes with regard to the other federal funding that has been frozen. So we mentioned that earlier. We also have one about birthright citizenship. So check that out and stay tuned with us. We will catch you next time on the Legal Weekly Wine.